So this is real imposter syndrome. You had Brett talking about growing cows, you had Sophie doing about rare earth, and then you've got this criminal talking about hacking cars. But there's a journey here. So for the last 28 years, I have predominantly been a hacker, and that's looking at building the core internet that a big chunk of everybody uses, but also breaking into everything you can imagine, as we did in the 90s and early 2000s and 2010s and 2022. What's weird is I'm also a car person. And I do have a bit of an addiction problem. I've restored 30. I currently have 6. I had to tell the wife about the most recent one that I've owned for 7 years because we're actually moving house, and I hadn't told her for a very long time. It became that awkward moment of, oh shit, she's going to find out about this big Mercedes from the 70s that I haven't told her about yet. But the car thing's fascinating because for me it's kind of a convergence of all of my hobbies and interests into one thing, and that's hacking, privacy, cars, and technology. So I don't actually own a modern car because they scare the living hell out of me. And they scare me because the cars that we've seen, next slide, thanks, have drastically changed from when Carl Benz did it in 96 to Henry Ford. A lot of my early cars, I've got 2 Mercedes from the 70s, really simple, they work, they're 50 years old, they're temperamental, but there's no computers. And that's the fundamental part. Because what we're seeing with modern cars, such as Tesla and the early ones, to the Mercedes EQC and the Kia and so on, is that there are just a mishmash of technology and components and dodgy shell scripts and APIs and everything else thrown together, and people are not understanding how badly done these are. So out of interest, anybody here own a Tesla? Nobody, okay, that's probably a good thing. I do like Teslas. They're not the best build quality, but when you start reverse engineering a lot of the Tesla stuff and you see the stuff that a lot of people shouldn't see, you start to see shell scripts that control life support systems like the anti-crash and so on. And this is where it's starting to get really interesting. So at the moment, we're in a weird flux, especially here in London with petrol at £2. There's a massive rush for people to go into EV, which is great. Not the most environmentally friendly products, but also technology-wise, really interesting. There's also this big pressure to have everything connected. I've noticed walking around, everybody here has an Apple Watch, and an iPhone, or an Android phone, and so on. We're at the stage now where we have so much data collected about us that we have no idea where it's going. So for example, on your iWatch, on your Apple Watch, it's busy collecting your body vitals, how you walk, the pace of the walk, which foot goes down first, right? How your hips move, all this kind of stuff. That same technology is being moved into cars. So a friend of mine who runs the infamous hacking conference called DEF CON, every year thousands of hackers go into Vegas and do really nice things, and we're totally legit. He tried to buy a car, but he refused to buy a car that had any form of telemetry. In 2022, there is no such thing. You cannot buy a modern car that does not collect telemetry that you have any control over. And for me, this is where it's getting a bit scary. Next slide, please. So this is Molex. This was released last year. This is where the state of technology is for cars. That car, which you will probably start to see the technology being ushered into modern EVs, is a 10 gigabit network that allows streaming using Ethernet in a car. So modern cars today, if you look at how the CAN bus networks work, in the early 90s, you had a little OBD2 port that was mandated by California. You plugged it in and you got fairly basic details about a car. So how engines have changed is that now you have crank position sensors, you have sensors everywhere. The problem is modern cars are not environmentally friendly at all, no matter what a company tells you, because electronics break. And as somebody who's restored a lot of cars, the 90s were a great period. You buy a lot of cool hot hatches. The problem with all these cars is that the circuit boards are starting to die. The capacitors are starting to bleed. These become really expensive to fix. So technology like this is great, but Sophie talked about rare earth. We're now building cars that are effectively throwaway cars. But for me, the bigger risk is privacy. Next slide, please. So one of my backgrounds for the last decade has been helping, let's just say, government organizations go after really bad people. The 2 most successful cases we did was hacking the cars of the perpetrators to do something that that car should never have done. Now, in this case, it was very good because that perpetrator was really bad. But for me, it was that warning sign of This is no longer just a normal basic car. This is now a proposed weapon that somebody could take control of and do something with. And indeed, we're starting to see this with hyperconnectivity and Tesla. So Tesla has the autopilot functionality, which they keep on telling people is in beta. But since that was enabled, 247 crashes have occurred. And more recently, a few people have died. Now, here's a good idea. Take a 2-ton car, give it a stupendous amount of power, with a whole lot of bash shell scripts, an API, and pray to God the AI and ML works, and what do you have? There is the problem where we're starting to face. Now, I don't want to seem like a doomsdayer, but for all the cars that we've taken apart, we're starting to see an interesting little feature. The first is privacy, like I said. We have no control over what these cars are telling us about. So my wife and I needed a new car because London's got a low emission zone, so we bought a 2008 Mercedes because it was the only one I could really find that, one, didn't collect large amounts of data, and two, still looked pretty cool because I've got 2 Los Diablos children who are killing us, and it was the one that they could destroy without us worrying about it. We went for a service and Mercedes put in a Mercedes Me adapter. This little adapter was the Internet of Things for the car, which communicated via your phone. So naturally, I did what most people did. I reverse engineered it, look at the protocols. This adapter was sending location, GPS, how we were driving, a driving score, when we were filling up, where we were filling up, how much fuel, tire pressure, steering angle, yaw, and everything else, to an API in Germany. They were using the cloud, they were using AWS, but nowhere in the terms and conditions did they say this is what was being collected on me. So every single journey my wife was taking was being logged and cataloged. And this is the new state of cars today. You are effectively a data collection point for them, just as you've got with your Apple Watch and your iPhone and everything else. The next thing is complexity. So with my old Mercedes, the 72, as I said, she's a temperamental old girl. If she doesn't get driven for 3 months, I know how to fix her. The problem is that with that model, she is 50 years old now. I can still take it to a garage, I can get it fixed, I can drive it. With modern cars, at 20 years, where we're starting to see the degradation of components where capacitors are breaking, we're now starting to see mechanics who are refusing to touch it. Because if you've ever been into a modern car dealership, you no longer see any of the workshop engineers with dirty hands. They have laptops. And a lot of these old components are now breaking. So for example, 1997 Mercedes-Benz, there are many components that you can no longer get stuff for. For example, we had an old estate car. The RFID fob for the key, which was the alarm system, is no longer manufactured. That's it. So if that key breaks in your car, the car is effectively finished. You need to throw it away. So we're starting to see this massive amount of waste that's coming in. The next big concern for me is the AI ML race. So there's been a lot of hoo-ha about all things machine learning and AI. It's been a big part of my world at the moment. My wife is from Essex, which for those of you unaware, it's up there yonder, and it's a very cliched part of London as such. She's never been able to get Siri to work for her. And for me, it's a continual form of excitement when she picks up the phone and goes, Siri, oh, Frank. That's with Apple. What we're seeing with cars and what we're seeing with Tesla and indeed all the other manufacturers is that the AI ML world is still incredibly immature. Because what we're doing is trying to collect large amounts of data, do lots of data training on it to build these massive data sets. But we don't know what we're doing yet. So this is kind of a blurry world. And then the final one is this notion of hyperconnectivity. What we've started to see in more recent models is the ability for you to sync up your phone, for you to sync up your wallets, for you to sync up your Apple Pay and your Google Pay. So now, whereas before, the center of your digital world and your digital exhaust that I successfully exploited for a very long time was the phone, is now by extension becoming the car, the house. Idea, raise of hands. How many of you have got Alexa in the house? Cool. How many of you have linked that to some form of home automation or home control? How many have actually looked at the terms and conditions to see where that data is going? This is the big problem that nobody's really talking about. And for me, we're at that stage now where we have these devices, these cars, these watches that are effectively betraying us because we have no idea who's collecting that data. And as such, as with all things tech, what happens when that API is turned off? So that's kind of my pitch. The cars that you see today are interesting. The likes of me and indeed many of my other colleagues who do gain a lot of pleasure in tearing apart cars are starting to look at how we can subvert and indeed make these cars more secure. But it's going to be a very exciting time, I think, for security research and indeed all as consumers buying these cars. So thank you very much.
So obviously you explained in some detail how scary lots of this lack of knowledge is. It's that line of maybe the technology we've developed far in advance of our ability to use it. I think it's catching up a little bit. But at the same time, you said electric vehicles promise a lot.
Yep.
So in our theme here of the city in 2030, can you sort of conclude a little bit on, we'll have to overcome that threat, and consumers, us, will have to stand up for our rights as citizens and push car or transportation in this city towards what? It won't all be 1975 Mercedes.
It's a very good question. So here in the UK, we're trialing smart motorways.
Yeah.
The idea behind the smart motorway is to get rid of the hard shoulder, which if you break down, you can pull over safely. And the mindset is that modern cars don't break down. I love assumptions. And if the car did break down, they would use technology, specifically radars, to determine if a car was stuck in a lane, and then they would use the smart motorway to direct traffic around it. You're starting to see where this might go.
Yeah.
In the tech world, we are really crap at building stuff. Right, the factors. What we're seeing now is a lot of deaths from smart motorways from the fact that technology failed. Now, some of the more bigger proposed components that are coming out of Europe is that modern cars will have capability where the smart motorways will start determining if you're driving too fast and slow your car down. So you're no longer the controller of the car. Again, relying heavily on tech. So I think what we're seeing with how cities are building with petrol crisis, which is now starting to bite deep, is there's going to be a lot of emphasis on companies and governments looking at how they can control the vehicle to shape the movement of people and such.
Yeah.
I think as a consumer, we're not really being consulted quite heavily because people look at the flashy cars and go, I want the new Audi, right? I really think it's nice. I like that Kia. They're not going, but hang on a minute, who controls the puppet?
Yeah.
Right, and for me, that's the big concern.
2001 there, I think.
We are the puppet, yeah.
Yeah. Because the car, when it came out, was all about freedom. And there's been 100 years of people being able to go wherever they want with it. The idea the government can slow you down, and you've got nothing to do with it, is definitely not been solved.
It's very HAL 2001.
Right. Fantastic. Okay, Daniel, thank you very much.